Hello, this is my thesis proposal critique. I have a lot to cover, so I'll jump right in. So these are my readers I'm proud and I'm honored to have. Kent Larson, we've been talking about this for more than 8 years now, and he really made this research possible. We have Wes Chow. He's a head engineer for Center of Constructive Conversations. He is spearheading the lab's effort of decentralized society, and he's the backbone of theoretical and implementation-wise. So we need this. We have Kairos Shen. He's the executive director of Center of Real Estate, but throughout his career, he's working for the city of Boston as the chief city planner. So he has a very practical mindset, and he's also a process person. So let's dive in. I first want to start with a prologue, and I think it makes sense to talk about Jane Jacobs, the great urbanist. And I want you to see what she's holding here. She's holding a book called The Question of Separatism. It's basically about whether Quebec should separate themselves from Canada. One of the reasons it's unpopular, it's because the topic is controversial, but she's saying that we should learn from the peaceful example of the relative peaceful dissolution between Sweden and Norway in 1905. So as a nation-state level, this really talks about whether it's centralized or decentralized. And Ken Suzuki here, which is really the collaborator of this research, kind of pushes this to its extreme. So he says that conflicts get really severe when the transition is abrupt. And so if you think of a global conflict today, and you know that whether it's centralization, aggregating, or decentralization, having it separate, but he's trying to think of these currency systems or voting mechanism that how we can make the smooth or continuous society. And I think we have a solution, or at least one step forward to that direction, which I'm going to show this diagram a lot through this presentation, but it's the smooth or the transition between different structural organizations, meaning that in one hand you have a very centralized voting behavior, on one hand you have a decentralized voting behavior. But that was a pretext. Let's dive into the main text. So I chose this talk's title as Consensus Bricolages. Bricolages is a term that I borrowed from Levi Strauss from his 1966 book, The Savage Mind. And it's kind of a counter concept of planning. And I like to use the software engineering way of saying this, where planning is waterfall, and bricolages is more about ad hocing, or just like in this small video, kind of mixing and match together and trying to solve and be creative. Right off the bat, I want to talk about the problems and the goals for this research. We don't want limited participation in consensus building. We want greater inclusion. I think that's clear and easy. I'll talk about NIMBYism and why contradiction matters. Instead, I want to reveal trust paths so that I can give information for alignment strategies. And we don't want multiple approval paths. We want to have consolidated approval paths so that these siloed authorities are kind of in sync. So in essence, it's consensus. So it doesn't have to be cities. But one reason is that I'm in the city science group in the media lab, but also as Aristotle started on politics, it's on polis. So I think it's still a good idea to start with cities in terms of consensus building. So today I have 3 cities and these 3 distinct processes. I happen to live in these cities throughout my life. And so we have New York, Houston, and Boston. And Kairos always uses these 3 cities as examples of different distinct processes. New York, we have zoning. Houston, we don't have zoning. And Boston, quite interestingly, has frozen zoning. But I want to talk a little bit further than this, kind of thinking through what are the mechanisms to counteract the negative impacts. I'll be using a very traditional Marxist way of thinking about the society when you have a market at the base and the superstructure is, or everything else is on top. And we know New York is famous from zoning. This zoning ordinance is started in 1918, but we'll quickly understand that we have incentive zoning. And like, for example, plaza bonuses. And these incentives work really, really good. So much so that small, numerous plazas everywhere, and sometimes it's criticized by being leftover spaces. But I want to point out that the consensus concentrates the weight in zoning, this regulation, and the adaptability depends on how fast we can change zoning. Houston is famous for non-zoning, and Houston has been rejecting zoning, the idea of zoning. And if we open the map, we do see places that we have single-family housing right next to heavy industry. But is it really market forces only? Well, so Houston has a thing called deed restrictions, which tend to last for 25 to 30 years. And so these are neighborhoods, or neighbors kind of aggregating it together to kind of meet an agreement. What can you build in this neighborhood? So the metabolism rate really is dependent on these deed restrictions. So what about Boston, where we live, or our backyard? So Boston last had its citywide zoning overhaul in 1964, and it's basically frozen. And as Kairos likes to point it out, it's a discretionary process. And the hallmark is Article 80, but we also have the abutters engagement meetings and also deed restrictions, just like we saw in Houston. So basically you have everything in Boston, but one thing we can say is we have a lot of deliberation, and we want to keep that to some extent. So city science have been working on these city processes and how we can think about the future. And one example would be algorithmic zoning. Algorithmic zoning is basically you give a big slider of density, or FAR, that the citizens can tweak. It'll be very clear that what kind of community benefits they would be able to gain having fun with that slider. So this would be transparent and more predictable of what they will be expected or anticipate for that new development in return. The other platform is a Cityscope, which is these tangible interfaces, which is really meant for consensus building. This is an analytical framework for informed decisions and making decisions and deliberation. How does that deliberation look like right now? I've been attending to public meetings, both in Zoom, remote, and also in person. In the middle, you'll see me attending to the Article 80 reform feedback session. I will talk about that in the last part of this presentation, but also local developers have been giving me the opportunity to sit into these BPDA, the Boston Development Authority, and these developer internal meetings, how they strategize for public-facing meetings. I've been also collecting comments for the method that I'll be explaining today from past and present public officials. Generally, I have positive feedback, and I would like to thank personally to Andrew, Nigel, and Chris for their time. So I would like to kind of give you a sample approval path, one development project, and how its trajectory. So it's a 47-unit, 7-story housing rental project by a local developer that has been living in the neighborhood for 30 years. And they went through a lot of preliminary meetings. It took 900 and close to 30 days to be approved by the Article 80 process. They went through the small project review process. They eventually got approved the building shrank a little bit, but within that time frame, an architectural conservation district was designated. They respected the process, and currently they're going through this preservation effort. Despite the fact that BPDA already approved in terms of density, there were lots of comments on density. They listened to their comments, they shrank the building into 6 stories, and then they were ready for vote, for a review. Basically, that means a vote from the commissioners. But that didn't happen. It was under quorum. And there's a few reasons for this. And, well, one commissioner took a vacation. The other reason was the position was vacant because a recent committee member resigned, but they couldn't appoint a new one before the city budget, the New Year's city budget was approved. So now we're left with 1,400 days and counting. And it looks like they need to re-go through the BPDA process because it's a substantial change. They shrunk the building. So 1,400 days for a 47-unit, 7-story building, or 6-story building. I think we can do better. So what are the findings of me going into this process and actually listening for 3 hours? So with just 2 processes in this case, the BPDA and the historical preservation effort, we have multiple approval paths targeting the same density. And we learned that appointments are costly. We need some kind of legitimacy. Participation is costly, leading to very small meetings, a loud minority in this case. It's, again, as I told you, it's 3 hours of your time for a week. That's a lot of commitment. And this is always the case in public meetings, where participants have very different levels of knowledge. I want to talk about NIMBYism. And as much as I like going into these public meetings, I catch the hobby of reading these public comments. So this is a very good example of what NIMBYism is. So it starts with, first, let me say I'm not a NIMBY. And then the next question starts with a but. And it goes on and on why he doesn't like the project. But what I want to point out here is that not in my backyard has a pretext here saying that, yes, I support the broader idea of having more housing in Boston, but not in my backyard. And maybe it's, yes, I support the broader idea, it's good for the environment, for the greater environment, but not in my backyard. Yes, I support the broader idea of having more immigrants because that's the way we should go as an international community, but not in my backyard. So another reason, another example here, it's from a recent podcast that the group likes. It's called the It's a Klein Show in New York Times. And it's about a golf course in Denver, Colorado. And there's an easement of leaving this as a golf course, which is underused. It's not really used for, I think, 5 years. And there was a recent proposal of having 3,200 housing development. And the neighborhood decided to reject it, not having that kind of development, despite the fact that there are pro-development bills passing in a state level. In the podcast, they concluded the same people are extensively voting for different levels of government for things that seem contradictory. We've seen in the comment, yes, it was kind of, there was a pretext of, yes, I support the idea, but not in my backyard. So it's not just me kind of pointing it out as a contradiction. But as a process, it's really easy to demonize these people or like criticize them as hypocrites. But I think through this process, that's not part of the solution, is to embrace that nuance people naturally have into that system so we can extract information for alignment. So these are the problems I felt through this survey. One is limited participation, costly participation and appointment, and it's dominated by the loud minority. And two is we saw contradiction, and that leads to NIMBYism. This contradiction is unquestioned, and there's no strategy for alignment. And we saw multiple approval paths, siloed authorities not really talking to each other. We know it's very costly for syncing information, but these processes are kind of canceling out each other. On the flip side, for our method, we want greater inclusion. We want to make participation easier and to incorporate people with diverse views. We want to reveal groups' trespass. So somehow if we can identify key individuals, groups, or categories, that information we can use for efficient alignment discovery. We want to consolidate approval across departments. We want to preserve that deliberation. We want to preserve that agenda and the deliberation that's coming with it between these stakeholders, but we do want to avoid these siloed authorities. And those are the solutions, and this is the motivation, the main motivation of this study. This research wants to realize a method that collages, so this comes back to the title of this talk. I want to collage different levels of participation, different diverse organizational structures, and diverse processes. How would I do that? The kernel of this research is about propagational proxy voting. So it says voting, but it might be just a voting mechanism, but it's really to facilitate the consensus building process. In order to explain what it is, I need to go back to direct voting. So this is easy. So one constituent holding one vote picks one out of n policy plans. This is easy. This is direct democracy. We have representative voting, meaning that if you have someone that you trust, you delegate your whole vote to someone, like your mayor. We're also used to stakeholder groups. In a national level, this might be your political party. In a local level, this might be your neighborhood association. So this is where propagational proxy voting diverges. So it's kind of combining those two by dividing votes into pieces so that you can express nuances. And two, you're allocating to different domains. So you can choose the level of participation. So what does that look like? So this is an example. I gave one quarter of my plan to a specific policy that I feel good. But then I decided to give half of my votes to a delegate that I trust. The remainder might go to a stakeholder group or a neighborhood association that I trust, that I know that has been protecting the neighborhood for different risks. So, but people might ask, oh, Yasushi, this is good, but this is complicated. I'm already having trouble picking one out of two. How would I actually divide my votes? So propagational proxy voting doesn't force you to divide your votes. If you're indifferent, or if you just live far, if you don't know about the context, you just delegate to, for example, your mayor. But if you really have strong opinions, or you just live close to that development, you can change your voting behavior to have a direct democracy type of participation. When I say greater inclusion, which is one of the benefits I'm trying to propose here, is that these very different voting behaviors can coincide into one workshop or a session. And also legitimacy is also derived by delegation, right? Meaning that how many fractional votes you have accumulated and you're kind of voting on behalf. This is not legal, but we can compute that. And also, if we chop up the process and say, for example, yesterday we decided on policies, today we're thinking about stakeholder groups, tomorrow we'll talk about categories of policies, we can still have a comprehensive result. The second benefit is removing trust paths. This is really for alignment discovery. So right now, as we talk for the golf course example, these people can render very different voting behaviors depending on the context. On one hand, you might say, yes, let's have more housing. On the other hand, you might say, oh, I don't like this housing plan, it's going to destroy. So instead, propagational proxy voting makes you think whether, do I really support the broader idea, or do I really care about the project next door? Also, through iterations, I can compute how important a delegate is, or how important a category is. This is very useful information because through iteration, we can aim for better alignment, meaning that the voting behavior or the voting structure, the voting organizational structure would shift time to time about that discovery. We also want to consolidate approval paths. So like we saw in the example of a very small or a mid-sized project taking 1,400 days, the BPDA, the Article 80 process, and the Architectural Conservation District process kind of canceled their results to each other. For propagational proxy voting, the constituencies can decide, in this case, which institution or which group is more relevant. So this is important because in a naive way of doing it is to destroy all the institutions and resort to direct democracy, but that's not going to solve the problem. We want to still preserve these institutions or groups or stakeholders and the agenda and the deliberation surrounding it, but we also want to consolidate it. So these are the three benefits that I'm putting through this method. We have greater inclusion. We are making participation easier because people can choose the level of commitment. And this would incorporate people with diverse views. And we're revealing groups' trust paths. This is to identify key individuals, groups, and categories so we can use that information for alignment. We're also trying to consolidate approvals across different departments. Again, we're preserving that deliberation, we're preserving that agency, but we're also avoiding that siloed authority. This is how it looks internally. You can see that Alice, Bob, and Charlie, and Daniel is the constituencies, and they're deciding whether this project should be 2 stories, 4 stories, or 6 stories. The NA, the stakeholder, stands for a neighborhood association, and the category here is density is good. So this is the same network of trust represented in a matrix. So if you can see, if you sum the column, it will sum to 1. So that means you're dividing your votes and allocating into different places. Under the hood, it's using Markov chains, which has been around for more than a few decades. We've been extensively using for predicting market shares. And City Science have also used this technique for transportation simulations and transit simulations. So we know how it works, but in this case, we're utilizing the same technique for trust paths. I would like to show how the math works without actually showing any formula. So right now we have the vote holders in the red circle, and it's holding water worth of 1 vote. And the idea is that these water goes and trickles down and being collected into options. So every constituent is holding a vote, and let's quickly advance it. So you see that water is kind of finally landed into these 3 options. Let me do this again. So in this case, Daniel is the most easiest to interpret because Daniel is giving his whole vote to 6 stories. So as soon as he gets something, he's going to just give it right down to this purple bucket. So he's holding 1 vote. He gives all of it to the purple bucket. But now he gets some back from Bob, but right after that, he's just giving it back to the purple bucket. And then also he gets some back. And now you see that the blue bucket, in this case, 4 stories, won this voting session. By the way, do you see the NIMBY situation here? It's actually Alice, that she's allocating somewhat 10% of her support to pro-density. Density is good, but she's also advocating for only 2 stories. That means less density. So this is all the math. Really, Ken Suzuki started this 10 years ago in a Japanese book. But he's a collaborator now. We're working on this paper together. And we submitted this to a journal. And it's right now in peer review. We hope to have this out for a few weeks. We generalize this propagational proxy voting with the context of liquid democracy and observing Markov chains. But math is not enough in this case. We need computation. So this is a graph showing on the horizontal scale the number of delegates, so how many people can participate. And the vertical scale was showing seconds, how many seconds it would take to compute. The red line shows that I'm using a naive implementation using Python, NumPy, so it's still kind of optimized, but with the help of Parfait, we've been able to drastically scale this up so we can use it for larger communities. So the blue line is me adopting how Parfait calculates it and maybe optimizing it for using a different language. But we haven't used techniques such as sparse matrices or even GPU. We're thinking of implementing a GPU version of this. This would, again, drastically scale how much we can incorporate the scale of of participation. We think we can open source this. So this is another contribution. So we have the math, we have the computation, we have the code. Let's calibrate this idea. And this is a good example of how it would look like. I'm going to use this year's Cambridge Participatory Budgeting Project as an example. This is Cambridge City allocating $2 million of its budget in a kind of a grassroots way. It has 20 proposals. These plans are proposed by residents and voted by residents. If we look into one example, so each proposal has a title, a category, a cost, a location, and a description. Again, we have 20 of these policies or proposals, and Cambridge decided to have 4 categories: environment, community resources, transportation improvements, facilities, parks, and recreation. So I did this in between a talk that I gave to a junior high school class. So we have 69 delegates. So these are 15-year-old junior high school students. And we have 10 stakeholder groups. In the picture, you see 10 tables. So these are stakeholder groups. Each table had 6 to 7 students. It was a 40 or so minute workshop. And I had a simple web app to calculate the results. So this is validation or calibration. So I kind of sequentialed the flow in order to have different inputs. I first asked the students to rate 20 proposals in 3 minutes. And then, again, also individually, I asked the students to rate the 4 categories in 3 minutes. So these 2 are individually done. Then I asked the students to have a group discussion within their tables. Again, we have 10 tables. And then give a presentation, a brief presentation to their classmates. What do they think as a group? And then we went back to individual evaluation and asked them to rate the 10 teams, how they did. And also, let's say I asked the students to rate their classmates. In this case, pick 3 of the most trustworthy person, the people that is well suited for this topic. And then we had the results revealed. So we have 2 kinds of outputs here. One is consensus. This is traditional voting outcome, what you usually see in a voting session. And the new part of it is relevance ranking. This is propagated weights of trust. Let's look at that. So this is the result of all 20 proposals. If you sum up all the votes, it's 69. It's a good sign because we have 69 students. So 1 person, 1 vote still holds. The specific proposal may not be the most important thing, but in this case, smart recycling trash compactors won the game. And you'll see that the votes are fractionalized. This is a new piece of information that I can offer. This means that in categories, environment had 4.58 more times the influence or the relevance compared to someone that is holding 1 single vote. So it had 4.58 times more the push. This is already useful for the community, because now it looks like, oh, we really value environment. Let's look into the specific policies that's hanging under that umbrella. Right? I can compare different things, meaning in the red chart, I'm showing this person, MF, had 2.56 times more the push, again, compared to a single vote holder. This means we can start to ask MF, share her insights or her thought processes, right? To have the community kind of learn from this person. Also, table 8 may have been more influential compared to the other tables. We can ask table 8 for more information. Using the same relevance ranking, I can start to compare different things. So this shows that categories was more important than any other stakeholders in this case. So it gives more reason that we really need to think about categories before we talk about or kind of interview table 8. But this could be iterative. Right? The first one may concentrate a lot of votes to categories. The next, it might concentrate to tables or people. And gradually, the whole network may kind of either change to a direct democracy mode, or maybe even people start to collect trust in table 8 and they really delegate to table 8. So this is, again, I'm repeating this benefit that I'm going to propose as a institution or process level, right? So we see in the first example that Alice actually was very influential. Part of it because she was in the neighborhood association, but part of it is because she did collect a lot of delegation. Oh, it's almost on par with Bob. So this means that if she changed her behavior of putting more weights to 2 stories, in this example, kind of overcoming this dilemma of NIMBYism, this would change the result. It was 4 stories, but it will be 2 stories. So in this case, Alice's is very important. And knowing that information will be crucial for understanding the misalignment. Again, this would help for the community to shift their structure of trust smoothly. I've been thinking about related concepts through these years. NAMAF is a project that we did. It won the Wired Common Ground Award. It's a multi-sig DAO, a very simple one, but with a very complicated topic, meaning implementing a biomass simulation together as a group. New Result Machine is a wall art project and comparing different aggregational rules. So if we chose propagational proxy voting to rather majority rule or Boldo rule, the result would differ. This is to make people aware that even if you have the same will as the input, if you swap the algorithm or how we count the votes, the result will change. City Animals is kind of a design activity where I think how I can design a workshop to rank multiple dimensional topics, which is complicated. Urban projects are complicated, using mix and match toys. And other uses of propagational proxy voting so far. I made a simple web app called Neverwhere. This is a favorite city survey, kind of a fun one in conjunction with the uses of generative AI. You can kind of mix and match cities, and you can also add aspects of the city. You can also delegate using PPV. I've been also using this for internal product evaluation for Topan. It's an architectural finishing company. And I've also used the same method for a survey study for national security for the Cabinet of Japan. So this is what I have. Next steps and case studies is what I have here. I have 3 case studies in my mind. Case study A is about community benefit allocation. So this is close to Cambridge participatory budgeting. The scope is individual urban development projects. Case study B is Article 80 formula temperature check. This is thinking about a higher level understanding of goals across projects, so multiple projects. Case study C is what we call multi-agent governance and interface. This is a little bit far from development. It's to co-create with machines, but it's to create ethical standards for trusting or actually delegating machines. Application A is all about community benefit allocation. In the group, we have a roughly 2 million square feet project. And with the help of CRE, the Center of Real Estate, we can now have economic formulas that can estimate the amount of return. With that, we can estimate the amount of public benefits we will gain through that investment. So these are the required community benefits for the district. But usually in these big development, you have something called impact fees. Kairos likes to talk about this as linkage fees. Kent likes to point this as endowments. But this is one chunk of money that we can allocate, just like, again, like the Cambridge participatory budgeting example, allocate public benefits. Application B is about consensus on Article 80's dynamic formula. So again, Article 80 is in the midst of reforming. This is a generational opportunity for thinking about the process. And within that, there is one section about consistent standards. What they're trying to do is to first set these categories of benefits or mitigation, and also have a public formula to set limits to allocate to these public formulas. I think propagational proxy voting is a great tool for early engagement and temperature check of categories of specific usages. So for example, in the shore side, people might decide for more mitigation-oriented benefits like flood protection. Inland, people might ask for affordable housing or a public library. The last application is what we call MAGI, multi-agent governance interface. What we see here is normal propagational proxy voting, but now we can quickly have AI or these machines or simulations as a delegation target. Now, I want to be clear that human still holds the votes. It doesn't mean that the AI decides by its own, but we will always have the choice to whether delegate to machines. And we can have delegation back from AIs using PPV because AI in this case, or the machines in this case, is playing the same game. They can vote for their fellow AI peers, or they can vote for human. Also, they can vote directly. This is, I think, one example of society in the loop, where we have humans and machines working together, and they're kind of kicking back, so it closes the loop. We can gauge the trust understanding among different level topics, and I think this would help create standards for ethical use of AI in society. So that was it. I would like to conclude my presentation with a small epilogue. It's about how nuanced we are. And sometimes we like to blame technology, that it made everything simple and accessible, but we blame it because we feel it kind of caused polarization, or it made it hard for us to actually talk to each other as technology or social networks advance. And we know that we are nuanced in a personal sentiment level, and appreciating or understanding that the other side is also nuanced is actually the first step of having a good mutual conversation. I've showed you that in a social level or a society level, we do contradiction. So we are nuanced in a social level also. But in fact, we are nuanced in a biological level. So this is Gabby in our group sharing her gene tests. And we understand that even at a biological level, we are kind of a mixed match or a collage of different cultures, good or bad. I think we want to let our democratic processes also be flexible to incorporate this kind of nuance and yet still being accessible. Thank you.